versions of American history that either minimize the presence of and the concerns of people of color by failing to represent them at all, or they presented people of color as an obstacle to be overcome, as in the story of westward expansion. These educational films purported to be authoritative presentations of American history, and they probably didn't say anything that wasn't true. They probably didn't lie, but they did operate with the premise of white supremacy. Probably all of us here were exposed to such films in high school classes. They were really like wallpaper. In these films, real Americans were white. We can look back now and see very clearly the real Americans were understood to be white by hard work and clever politics, such as the Louisiana Purchase. Whites had recreated something akin to the Garden of Eden here. The natural beneficiaries were white because whites were the ones who had conquered the land, and any benefits to others were optional, a matter of grace. So the requirement that all immigrants must assimilate, adopt white habits in order to be included. And those who could not assimilate because of their skin color or their physiognomy were clearly inferior. And this is the point of view of Project 2025. If we were taught anything about non-white people in American history, and I was not, it was that slavery of African Americans was taken care of by the Civil War. And the constitutional amendments that were made during Reconstruction had further taken care of the problem and the people. Recalcitrant natives were rounded up on reservations where they had treaty rights and were educated in free boarding schools. Very, very far from what actually transpired. There's no lie there, but there's a complete misunderstanding of those lives. Asian and Latin American people built the railroads and harvested our food, but they sent their money home, and they wanted nothing more than to go home as soon as they could. So we didn't really need to think about them. Not a word in my education in 10 different schools from Massachusetts to Florida, not a word was said about the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, the widespread practice of lynching, free labor from slaves and prisoners, redlining as a means of segregating neighborhoods and schools, Chinese Exclusion Act, internment of Japanese people, World War II. You might say it was my privilege not to know what had really happened. So white privilege is another term that is used that you would like us to consider. It's a set of advantages and immunities that white people benefit from on a daily basis. And again, I'm going to read this sentence twice. White privilege can exist without white people's conscious knowledge of its presence and how it helps to maintain racial hierarchy in this country. White privilege can exist without white people's conscious knowledge of its presence and how it helps to maintain the racial hierarchy in this country. We don't need to intend it in order to be part of it. What keeps whiteness in place as a norm? Some identifiable elements of American culture that apparently keep whiteness in place include things that are considered quite admirable in the culture to some. Perfectionism, for instance, a drive to be the best or a drive to make no mistakes. Paternalism, the belief that father knows best. Fear of resistance to criticism. We see this every day on our news. Distrust of oral knowledge, the failure throughout our history to see native or slave stories as meaningful, for instance. Thinking that there's only one right way to do or say things, so the judgment of Black English or native languages as uneducated somehow. The list of features that are often identified as problematic is a long list. And it would be impossible, really, to eradicate these features of our culture. No one is really calling for that. The point is not to trash our dominant culture, but to locate its ways of valuing whiteness over everything else to the exclusion of dark-skinned people. And to question this habit and to replace it with respect for all people, our first principle, right? So as civil rights activist Audre Lorde has said, it's not our differences that divide us. It's not difference that we have to fear. It's really our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And the ideology of white supremacy stops us from that celebration. So dismantling whiteness is a process of deconstructing and challenging systemic, I should say, institutional and cultural practices that perpetuate racial inequity. And this framework moves beyond addressing individual prejudice to analyzing how the socially constructed concept of whiteness has become an invisible norm and a source of racial privilege. Dismantling white supremacy culture and the privilege within oneself is a lifelong process, really, that involves self-education, self-reflection, and intentional action. Since it's built into the fabric of society, individuals must actively seek to unlearn it. As anyone who's tried to break a habit knows, unlearning is not easy. In some ways, it's harder than learning the first time around. But this work is necessary for people of all racial backgrounds, since the dominant culture affects everyone and the culture is internalized by everyone of every color, every race, every whatever. And it requires unlearning both thoughts and feelings. It involves a good deal of discomfort, but it can also be very rewarding. The process of unlearning or relearning can take many, many forms. There's no one right way. But I have found that relearning American history is a great way to begin. I think many Americans have begun already by reading and viewing the great body of literature published since the 1960s in fiction and nonfiction and memoir and biography and autobiography, and then in documentaries and docudramas and feature films. There's plenty of material out there to generate the process of relearning or unlearning. Our UU Book Club is a great resource for this. Many, many of the materials that they've dealt with have been terrific. But the project is really urgent now because Project 2025 is working actively against it with book bans, with interference in school curricula, with pronouncements throughout the media. So that I'm actually beginning to think that we should be stockpiling our books and films in private places outside of public libraries and so on, so that we can be sure that what we have relearned can continue to be shared. Becoming aware of how we were taught the value of whiteness is something that all of us can do, beyond looking at American history. I'll spare you a complete history of my own journey, but I'll share some parts of it in order to kind of illustrate for you how whiteness dominated my early life and how it began to give way to other perspectives. I don't know how many of you know that I was actually born in Virginia and lived in Maryland, Georgia, and Florida before I was 14 years old. But I have no memory of a single black person for that entire time. No memory. Think about what that has to mean about the environment that I was in. I was living in these places. No memory of even having seen a black person. I went to boarding school in Massachusetts, and there I had one class in biology from a young black woman who was the only black faculty member at the school. School is doing much, much better at that now, but still difficult. The next year, actually, my senior year there, I became a quote-unquote big sister to a junior student who was black, my first black friend. But the prescribed relationship was an unequal one, okay? Lovely. I was the big sister who was supposed to, and include her, show her the ropes, so to speak. But there I am, and there she is. And, so even that is problematic. Still, Ernestine Brazil is the first black person whose name I remember. Okay, I was already 15 years old, 16 years old probably by then, before I can remember a black person's name. Now, my parents were from small towns in upstate New York that had not experienced the Underground Railroad, which was very active in New York State. But my father attended the Episcopal Theological Seminary in New York City, and there he apparently learned that we're all God's children. But some of those children would have to wait for admission to American culture until they became better educated. So when the sit-ins at the Woolworth soda fountains began in Rochester, New York, where I attended university, I fell back on my father's position that blacks were not ready. They would have to wait. Not ready for what? I wonder now. And how would I have known? I who had absolutely no experience with African Americans, how would I have known whether they were ready or not? Ready for what? There's zero knowledge. And it all seemed, perfectly normal. I had no consciousness of what that meant. what these actions, what these words meant. No consciousness whatsoever. No bad intentions, no bad feelings, no fear really, but an ideology, something that was hidden even from me at that point. And how embarrassing, how dreadfully embarrassing it is to look back on that. Well, luckily I married Chuck, and he was called to Wesleyan University in Connecticut in the 60s, where several members of the faculty were freedom riders. They'd been to the South, they had given blood, sweat, and tears. Others were social historians who were already involved in looking carefully at the under layers of the society and were beginning to understand how some of these things had happened. Martin Luther King was an acknowledged hero, and he came to speak, and it was overwhelming. It was like an immersion, experience of baptism, and it was wonderful. But of course, it took time to really absorb this tremendous change in the thinking that I had been exposed to before. So overall, it was a really slow journey to change my awareness of how whiteness had worked to obscure and to devalue the lives of people of color. For instance, in the early 70s at Lawrence, a brilliant black student lived with us for a year. We were incredibly lucky. And he introduced our family to jazz. He had a jazz radio program, and so he was always talking about what he was going to put on the jazz program, and we were listening to that. It was a fabulous experience. And one day he handed me a beautiful novel by Jean Toomer, from the Harlem Renaissance. I had a PhD in American literature. I had never heard of the Harlem Renaissance. I didn't have a bad education at my university. It's just that no one there saw the need to present this really incredibly important movement within American literature. Nobody had bad intentions. It wasn't a bad place, but good and evil don't have anything really much to do with this. It has to do with the acceptance of these premises about who's important, what work is important. At UW Green Bay, when we developed the women's studies minor in the late 70s, I became aware of the rich body of literature that had been created by African American women. Toni Morrison was very, very visible at the time, and she spoke everywhere about the importance of this body of work. But it was almost impossible at that point to hire a black woman in Northeast Wisconsin. No black woman, professional woman, wanted to come to Appleton or Green Bay. They did not want to live in this white environment. They understood very, very well what I did not understand at all. And at a conference, actually it was a Midwest Modern Language Association conference, I asked Audre Lorde, the poet, what we should do. And she said, "You do what your colleagues have done to teach Shakespeare. You study the work, you learn the relevant history, and you bring it to the classroom wherever you can. Just get out there and do it. Your job is easier than teaching Shakespeare because you share a language and a culture with the people whose works you're teaching." So I went ahead and I did develop several courses, always feeling vulnerable, that I didn't know enough, that I could be tripped up in any sort of way. But also, I was very pleased that students responded well to the literature. It was not difficult to teach at all in those days. Okay, not all of my experiences were positive. Some of them were wrenching. Part of the process of relearning and unlearning is to overcome negative feelings, to allow the changes in understanding and behavior to take place. White fragility is real. And it's best handled in groups of close friends so that you can deal with those feelings and not be completely derailed by them. But it's not a deal breaker. It's possible to get through those feelings, and it's not a bad thing to have them, to really begin to empathize so much with people of color, other people with other differences. And given the blatant threats at the moment against diversity, equity, and inclusion that are present in our government, in our schools, even in some of our religious institutions at present, maybe one of the most important things we can do is to reflect more deeply on the ways that the belief in white supremacy has gotten under our very own skins and, of course, into our history. These are good things to do. However, in the New Atlantic magazine, David Brooks argues that the U.S., and he's right, desperately needs a unified social movement right now to counter the movement toward autocracy. He is right. The question is, how do we bring about that kind of unified response so that it can be big enough to actually reverse what has got so much momentum at this point? And I'm wondering, this is something I'd like to talk with you about over time, whether since the new administration has declared DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to be an enemy of the people, so that it has to be stamped out wherever it appears. And thank God most people who've been involved in that process are just simply finding different ways to talk about what they're doing. They haven't stopped doing it. But I wonder if a counter vision to restore DEI and depose white supremacy might not work to galvanize a new movement. At the moment, it seems that our legislature is attempting to create a movement around healthcare, and that may work, but it may not be big enough. It may not affect enough people. Equality and inclusion have been cornerstones of the American way for far too long to disappear overnight. Equality is one of those basic beliefs of American culture that I think will be hard for the right to depose completely. And inclusion, with all of its problems in terms of the ideology of assimilation, is still a very, very strong tendency within American culture. All over the world, people are amazed at how, when they come to the United States, people take them in. Now, whether or not the government responds the same way that people do is another whole issue. So the issue is difference. And difference, well, diversity is a positive biological principle. Why are we not arguing that really strongly, that in all through our sciences, we're talking about the necessity for diversity. Plant biology is concerned about this. The single crop nearly destroyed Ireland in the 19th century. We know a lot about the importance of diversity. Why do we not fight back with these ideas? Brooks is saying that what comes first in a really effective movement is vision. As Audre Lorde said, I quoted her before, it is not our differences that divide us, it is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. The ideology of white supremacy at the moment is very actively at work to stop us from that celebration. What are we going to do about it? So I look forward to hearing your stories and concerns in the discussion after the service. Thank you for continuing to think with me and think with each other about how ideas like race and white supremacy still work in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Estella. A lot to think about. Please join in body or spirit and stand for the singing of hymn number 170, We Are a Gentle, Angry People. I hope you will join us in the gathering room across the lobby for coffee, tea, and refreshments following the service. And after about 15 minutes, so at about 11:20, a chime will ring, and that will signal the start of the talk back, which will be over on this side of the sanctuary with Estella. We close today with words by Audre Lorde from the White Supremacy website. You do not have to be me in order to fight alongside each other. I do not have to be you to recognize that our wars are the same. What we must do is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other, and to work toward that future with the particular strengths of our individual identities. And in order for us to do this, we must allow each other our differences at the same time as we recognize our sameness. Carol, would you join me to extinguish the chalice? And the words to extinguish the chalice are from Maureen Killeran. We extinguish this chalice flame, daring to carry forward the vision of this free faith that freedom, reason, and justice will one day prevail in this nation and across the earth. Blessed be, may it be so.